This was the oddest of odd couples. But Sand had a history of having relationships with younger, weaker, slightly effeminate men. She did not do well with older, stronger, tyrannical men because she needed to dominate. Uh, so, but what she fell in love with Chopin was not the man himself. She knew nothing about the man. She fell in love with his playing and with his music because it was out of this world, magical, spiritual quality that was unlike anything she had ever heard in her life. And she referred to him as an angel who's speaking the language of God. And she was so enthralled with this, so overpowered by it, that she targeted him. She zoomed in on him for 18 months, pursued him very single-mindedly with the object of bringing him into her life. If you've read the handout that I gave you this week, they met at a musical soiree party at the apartment of Franz Liszt and Marie Dagout, his mistress. And Marie Dagout at that time was Georges Sand's best friend. She had visited them in Switzerland, where they fled Paris in the wake of the scandal. Marie had left her husband and children, run off with Liszt, and had a daughter, an illegitimate daughter, in Geneva, Blondine. That was the first of 3 children she had with him. And then after 18 months or 2 years, they came back to Paris. They were tired of being out of the middle of things. And they came back to Paris, and they were worried. What's the reception going to be? How are people going to react to us? But people were thrilled that they were back, and they started entertaining. And Georges Sand actually rented rooms right next to their apartment so that they shared a common sitting room and they could entertain friends together in a common room. That's how close they were. Marie Dagout had also spent 6 months at a time at Georges Sand's chateau, Nohant, which is about a 30-hour trip away from Paris in those days. That was her summer home. And Marie went there for months and months at a time, had her own special bedroom. Georges Sand got a piano just for Liszt so that when he had time to come visit between tours, he would have a piano to play on. And that's how close they were. They were like family. So Chopin showed up at this first soiree that was the one that was in November of 1836. And she was just thunderstruck by the genius and by the uniqueness of his talent and the power of his music making. He, on the other hand, was repelled. And he documented this in both letters to his parents and comments to a friend who had accompanied him to the event, which was later reported. She at that stage of her life, she was in the role of shocking everybody. She had divorced her husband, gotten custody of the children, wanted to be independent, had a whole string of lovers, famous and not so famous lovers. She clearly was a shocking, celebrated personality. It's a little bit like the early years of Madonna's career. And the male dress, and the cigar smoking, and the essays and the novels about free love and women's independence and radical revolutionary ideas for the times. She was an outlaw in every sense. Chopin is the most conservative. He's a monarchist, basically, who is worried about what people think. He dresses properly. He makes sure he never leaves his apartment without being impeccably coiffed by his hairdresser and dressed. And he goes to the best tailor in Paris, the most expensive, the best tailor, the best shirt maker, the best glove maker, the best boot maker. Everything has to be the best because he is moving in circles of the highest, richest level of the aristocracy and the bankers. And their wives and daughters are his students. That's how he's making his living. And when you have rich friends, you have to keep up the lifestyle. Not that it was difficult for him or a burden. He loved it. He was completely comfortable with the luxury and the beauty and having everything so fine. Sand, on the other hand, didn't care what people thought. She was out to shock and to do whatever she wanted to do as a free spirit. So here they are at this event. She's thunderstruck. He's repelled. But she doesn't give up. She asks Liszt and Marie to help her engineer another meeting. And about 3 weeks later, Liszt convinces Chopin to host one of these late night soiree musical events in his own apartment, which as an introvert, Chopin was not inclined to do, but with the encouragement of Liszt and Marie, push, 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 it'll be okay, you'll love it, it'll be fun. They invited all his Polish expat friends and musicians and artists and critics and writers, all kinds of famous people. And Sand came along with Liszt and Marie. And this time she dressed in a white pantaloon outfit with a red sash. And this is the blatant attempt to pander to his Polish nationalism, right? She dressed in the colors of the Polish flag. It took her another 18 months of pursuing him, but she did it, and they finally, I don't know how, she just wore him down. She figured out what he needed, I think, which was probably a somewhat maternal, supportive relationship. But they did become lovers briefly in the spring of 38. And Sand wrote a tortured 40-page letter to a friend of Chopin, a mutual friend, a Polish friend, trying to work out, should I, shouldn't I, is this right, is it wrong, and what's with him anyway? Why is he so resistant to me? And why does he resist us having a physical relationship? Let's look at some pictures now so you can see this cast of characters: Liszt and Marie and Georges and Chopin. I have some beautiful images from the time, from the 1830s. There we are. This is the famous double portrait that Sand persuaded Delacroix to undertake after they had become lovers, but was never finished. Nobody was satisfied with it, and the portrait remained in Delacroix's studio till after his death and was sold to another artist whose heirs dismembered it and cut it up into two portraits. Chopin's portrait ended up in the Louvre, and Sand's was bought by a Danish collector. Okay, so next one. And notice she's wearing a dress there. Okay, so going on, we have some Liszt and Marie. There's nice photographs of Liszt. You can see his very strong jaw, and he's thinking a lot of himself. And Marie was a countess who left her husband and her children. Chopin's Etudes, Opus 10, which I hope you listen to this week, are dedicated to them successively. Opus 10 to Liszt, and then Opus 25, the dedication was changed from Liszt to Marie because of this little incident with Liszt seducing Camille Pleyel's wife and using Chopin's apartment for the assignation. Here's Sand in a portrait by Charpentier. This is 1838, the year that she became Chopin's lover, and Marie Dagout looking patronizingly over at her. Now, Marie and Georges Sand's a really interesting friendship. They were extremely competitive. They both wrote fiction under a male pseudonym. They both smoked cigars, and they both had Eastern European pianist-composer lovers who were exactly 6 years younger. The thing was, Marie's husband was a rock star who slept with everybody, whose music was kind of second rate and had a kind of fatal vulgarity about it. Whereas Georges' lover was an angel who taught lessons, did not sleep around, withheld himself from the public stage, only gave a tiny, tiny number of concerts in his whole life, less than 30, his entire life, and held himself to this high, ethereal, spiritual standard of composition, not pandering to the circus trapeze school of empty virtuosity and tricks. Okay, now I would like you to hear from the words of Georges Sand herself. First, reading a letter from Georges to her mother. This is 1831. And my dear friend, Pascal de Lian-Richard, will read an English translation, of course, of Sand's letter to her mother.
My husband does exactly as he likes. Whether he has mistresses or doesn't have mistresses rests entirely with him. He can drink wine or water just as the fancy takes him, and he is free to save or spend. He can build, plant, sell, buy, run the house and the estate as he thinks fit. But it's only fair that he shall grant me the same liberty that he enjoys.
Exactement. All right, next slide. Thank you, Pascal. We see the Delacroix famous portrait, the double portrait that was commissioned by Georges Sand. They went in August to his atelier and they posed for the portrait. They had a little spinet piano in there. Oh, some more pictures of Georges. Interesting, the one on the right is by a previous lover, Alfred de Musset. And this is another lover of hers who was 6 years younger and kind of sickly. And very parallel to the Mallorca incident, she and Alfred went to Venice. He got terribly sick and she had to nurse him back to health. So when she dumped him, she found in Chopin a kind of replacement for the same relationship, with her in a maternal role to a weaker, younger man. Okay, next picture, I think there's Delacroix. So beautiful self-portrait, and the sketch, the pencil sketch for the double portrait of Chopin and Georges Sand. You can just barely make out the outline of an upright piano there. And there's some disagreement about what Sand is doing with her hands. Is she doing embroidery or is she holding a cigar butt? Let's look at the picture and see if we can figure out what's going on with the actual portrait. So the next one, that's a modern hypothetical reconstruction. It's very difficult for people to figure out how this portrait would have worked because the sizes of the heads and the proportions are just not right. And that may be why he never finished it, and maybe they were dissatisfied with it, and it was just put aside and left in his studio till he died, and then somebody else took it. Now let's see. Pascal has another reading about Sand falling in love with Chopin and struggling with her feelings. She wrote a 40-page letter to this Polish friend who was both a military hero and a banker. He was the head of the Bank of Poland and Chopin's dear friend, an older man who was kind of an advisor, older brother to him. So Pascal, now the reading, what should I do?
Until now, I have always been faithful to those I have loved. Perfectly faithful. I'm not of an inconstant nature, so slow to take fire, that I was rather disturbed at the effect Chopin had on me. I still have not got over my amazement. But if heaven would have us women faithful to earthly affection, why does it sometimes allow angels to lose their way among us and meet us in our path?
Merci, Pascal. She called Chopin an angel over and over, an angel music. And it's very funny. In the movie Impromptu, they have, which is fiction, largely fiction, but they have Judy Davis referring to Chopin as angel fingers to Marie Tagu. How is angel fingers doing? As she pursued him. But that's how she thought of him, as this ethereal spiritual being. And she did not see the man. She saw the genius, which she recognized was far greater than her own. And she was willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of his genius to support him and to be close to him and to be close to this music, which so bewitched her. Now, he probably played nocturnes and mazurkas and short pieces at these salons and a sonata with Liszt. They played a big four-hand sonata together. But you have to remember, Chopin was not just a sickroom, weakly, wimpy talent. He wrote music of heroic strength, especially the Polonaise and some of the sonata movements. This is anything but a weak, wimpy, angel fingers kind of a delicate talent. It's extremely virile, strong music. So about the same time, they were just starting this affair in June of 38. he was putting the finishing touches on two mazurkas, the A major and an F sharp minor opus 40. So I would like to play for you the famous A major mazurka, and you reconcile the strength of this with the historical reputation of Chopin as some kind of a sick weakling. Yes, angel fingers, but fingers of steel with a velvet glove, as my teacher used to say. Now, our lovers, they're having this affair. They're having their portrait painted by Delacroix, who's a good friend, but they do not want gossip. Chopin has a horror of gossip and tittle-tattle, and especially he does not want this to get back to his parents, his religious conservative parents in Warsaw, who would be horrified if, after his failed engagement to this virginal Polish aristocratic girl, remember Maria Wodzinska from last week, the 16-year-old, that engagement fell apart. And this is where he goes next. This is this most infamous, most famous woman in Europe who's known everywhere because of her scandalous writing and her scandalous behavior. So he wants to conceal the relationship. So they engineer to get away. He's not feeling well. He has this constant cough. Constant cough. Marie Dagu says Chopin coughs with unspeakable charm. It was constant. And he was always having gum water, which meant water with opium, to kill the cough and soothe his throat. But he was basically pretty healthy, but fall's coming. Fall is a dangerous time for him. The weather changes, it's cold, and he gets sick every year in winter. Also, Maurice, Sand's son, who's like 14, 15-year-old son, is also having some kind of rheumatism sick problem. But mainly, Georges Sand wants to get out of town with Chopin and have a quasi-private honeymoon. So her friend, Charlotte Marliani, who's married to the Spanish consul, advises her that, well, have you thought about maybe Mallorca? It's a paradise, lemon trees, blue skies and sun. It's the perfect retreat. You'll go and you'll be warm and everyone will recover and you'll have this lovely winter season in the sun. So Sand had never been there. She knew nothing about it. She didn't do any research. She didn't know there was a civil war going on in Spain and there were 10,000 refugees from Spain who had flooded to Mallorca and there was no housing. She had no idea about anything. She just got this idea in her head and go, full steam ahead, control freak. So she took Maurice out of school. Maurice was in Delacroix's atelier. She took Solange out of her boarding school, and they traveled separately by coach down to Perpignan. And Chopin had to leave a few days later. Nobody should suspect that they're leaving town together. And they go to Perpignan, they meet up, they go to Barcelona and catch a boat. Now, I have a whole bunch of pictures to show you. We'll have to go through them quickly, but it's quite a story. There's Maurice and Solange. Chopin had never met these children until they showed up together in Perpignan. And it's like, hi, kids, this is Frédéric, and we're going to be together now all winter, maybe for a year. They had both borrowed enough money to be away for a year. They didn't know when they were coming back. It was open-ended. So there's little girl, little boy, okay. And next, they catch a ship called El Mallorquín, this paddle wheel steam thingy, and it takes about 16 hours to get from Barcelona to Mallorca. Next one, here's a map of Mallorca. You can see where it lies off the coast of Spain. It's the big island off the coast there of the three. And their ship had to go to Palma de Mallorca. And if you look directly north of Palma on that map, you'll see a place at way up high in the mountains called Valdemossa. That's where they ended up, way up high in the mountains in an abandoned monastery, because there was no housing appropriate and because he was sick. And unlike in France, where they did not believe that consumption was an infectious disease, in Spain, they were horrified. They treated him like he was a leper. As soon as they found out that he was coughing and sick and called a doctor, they were evicted from their rental house in Palma. So I have a picture of that. Let's keep going. There's some Palma, some pictures. These are touristy pictures. You can see the town and the cathedral. Georges Sand toured the town and visited the cathedral. They had a little town, little house. Next one, Saint-Vent. It's their house in Palma. And they were there maybe 2 or 3 weeks. They had nice weather for about 2 weeks. And then the rains came early. Let's go next one. Next slide. The rains came early that year and it got freezing cold. And this house had no heat. It was so cold that the dampness of the walls, the water vapor would freeze to the walls. And the only way to heat it was with charcoal open braziers. And the smoke of the charcoal was horrendous. And then the landlord found that Chopin was sick and he had them evicted and he charged them for all the bedding and the furniture because it had to be burned. That's how the Spanish thought about TB. Next one. So she had to find a place quick. Where are we going to go? There was nothing except this abandoned monastery. So she loaded all their stuff. They had a rental piano and the kids and Chopin and all their stuff in a 2-wheeled, no springs mule cart called a birlocho. And they went up this road. Keep going, Leslie. Next one, I have kind of the road, this 3-hour trip in this mule cart up the mountain. And then they end up, next one, they go to this monastery. And because Maurice has been taking drawing lessons from Delacroix, he left us with some lovely sketches of the area. There's his sketch of the monastery, which is, this was abandoned. This is where they ended up renting a couple of rooms. And then the next one shows you a photo from today, what the place looks like. There, it's still there, and it's a tourist site, of course. And you can visit the cell that they occupied that winter. Keep going. Next ones, I've got some pictures of the corridors. Again, freezing cold. No heat, no running water, and they're alone in this place with a servant. And again, the heat is open charcoal braziers. Okay, next one. We've got the cells that they occupied. They figured out that they were in 2, 3, and 4. These are, about 18 feet. Oh, and there's a kitty in the door. How fortuitous. One door to the outside. And Chopin described them as very tomb-like. It was like being in an enormous tomb with this high vaulted ceiling and these cold, thick, the walls are about 4 feet thick, right? So very, very cold, which is nice in the summer, but in the winter it's freezing. Okay, next slide, we can see it's kind of a floor plan of the monastery. They were in 2, 3, 4, which is at the bottom of the image there, right in the center. And it looked out on a little courtyard. And they were stuck there for 59 days. Because the weather was horrible, it snowed. There would sometimes be 2 inches of snow in the morning. Next one. Then his piano had a horrible piano, really primitive instrument made by a local craftsman, Juan Bautza. And this instrument it was not a good piano, but it was a working keyboard. So it was better than having nothing because he had to compose at a keyboard. He did not just compose at a desk. And Wanda Landowska found this instrument and bought it and took it back to France. And it was seized by the Nazis in World War II and carted up and taken on a train to Germany and has disappeared. And nobody knows where it is. It's the most amazing story. So if you want a really good historical detective story that has all about music and World War II and what happened to the Jews in Europe and what happened to Chopin's piano, I can highly recommend this book, Chopin's Piano. So that's basically what he worked on when he was well enough to work. But of course, he got terribly, terribly sick. Let's go next one. Finally, at the end, they had ordered a good Pleyel piano from Paris, and it arrived at the very, very end of January. And they left on February 12th. February 13th to go back because he was so ill. He was coughing and spitting up basins of blood. And she was afraid he was going to die. So instead of having a year away and a honeymoon summer season in the sun in the Mediterranean, this was a total nightmare. And they had to go back down the mountain in that mule cart and catch the same boat back to Barcelona, which they shared with 200 hogs. That's the main export product of Mallorca was hogs. So the people were put in the little rooms under the deck and couldn't come out because the main deck was full of this herd of hogs going to market in Barcelona. Next one. Maurice made a sketch of the arrival of the Pleyel piano, which they uncrated, and miraculously it worked, and it must have been somewhat in tune because Chopin sat down and played it and drew a crowd of villagers who were just stupefied with admiration. They had never heard, never seen anything like that in their lives, and they probably never did again. Later, Chopin wrote about the whole incident in a book called Un hiver à Majorque. Next slide is I've got a book cover from 1953, and it was her way of getting even because she did not take responsibility for anything, for having decided to go there, for the conditions they endured and that he almost died and how miserable it was. She says, we were so alone in Mallorca as if we were on a desert, just alone in a desert. And she says, the moral of this story, childish as it is that man is not made to just live among trees and rocks and a pure sky and an azure sea, flowers and mountains, but with men who resemble him, with like-minded men. And she found the peasants of Mallorca incredibly barbaric and criminally inclined to steal things and overcharge them and, quite cruelly treated them as outsiders, very, very mean treatment. So she had no warm feelings about the Mallorcans, and she wrote this book to get even, which you can read to this day. She never mentioned Chopin by name, never ever, because of they don't want it to be. She's not using the book as a trophy to say, "Here's my lover, Frédéric Chopin." She refers to him as a member of the family. He's never named, he's never identified the whole time. Okay, now back to me. I would like to play you some of the preludes that were composed while he was there. He was finishing them. They were not really composed there, maybe 4 or 5 of them, but the great majority were already finished and sketched out when he was in Paris before they left. And then he was so sick he could barely work when he was there. But these preludes are amazing. The only other score he took with him to Mallorca was the Bach 48 Preludes and Fugues, his constant companion throughout his life. And his 24 preludes are an homage to the Bach preludes. There's one in each key. The difference is that Bach's plan was to go chromatically through the keys, so C major, C minor, C sharp major, C sharp minor, D major, D minor, whereas Chopin pairs them C major and its relative minor, A minor, and then going through the circle of fifths, G major and its relative minor, E minor. And what I find is that these little pairs are amazing yin-yang pairs that are perfectly balanced opposites. I don't know if he ever thought about how these works should be performed. He never performed the whole preludes himself. He would always perform a select few, take just a few, half a dozen or so, not the whole cycle. But now, of course, normally you hear the whole cycle all at once. And the end is just furiously tragic. It is absolutely black. And I won't play that one today, but it's just interesting. There's this whole kaleidoscopic range of emotions and textures. The other most revolutionary thing about these is how short they are, and how violent they are, and how daring the harmony is. The second one I'll play, I'm going to play the C major for you, which is an homage to the Bach prelude in C major. Most of these short preludes take a minute or less. They're tiny miniatures, but they are packed. They are dense. And the A minor, really interesting comment by André Gide, who was a pianist. And A minor is one of the most dissonant, most disturbing. And for him, he said it represented trauma. And there's a very dissonant rocking pattern in the left hand, which you'll hear. And he says it's like the rocking of someone who is mentally disturbed. As you will see, sometimes children who are mentally disturbed will rock to comfort themselves, or they rock. Anyway, so that was André Gide's comment. I don't know if I agree with that, but it is incredible in the dissonance, the excruciating dissonance. So first I'll do that first pair, C major, A minor, and then come back and introduce the next pair. The next pair is G major and E minor. And the next pair, D major and D major, B minor. Again, the B minor is a famous one. You'll recognize it. The left hand sounds like a, a cello solo, and that was also played at Chopin's funeral. It's the slow one. But the first one is amazing. Remember, he loves Bach, and he had the 48 preludes and fugues with him. This D major little etude prelude is kind of a two-part invention. There's only a single line, one note at a time in each hand, but they intersect in a really complex, wild way. And it's one of the hardest ones. I've worked on it, for years, and it's not gotten substantially easier. So we'll see if I get through this wild two-part invention, D major. It sounds a little bit like birds chattering, and it's chaotic. It's tightly controlled by him, but it sounds like chaos. And there are shifting accents and shifting. It sounds like shifting downbeats, shifting bar lines. So wildly rhythmic and fast and complicated, these two lines intersecting. And then the cello solo, which is another funereal sounding one. So again, a perfect yin-yang pair of preludes. one more pair. I love these. I'll probably go on too long. This is the E major and the C sharp minor. The E major sounds very stolid and masculine and strong, steady, forward motion. It's kind of a march in a way. The C sharp minor is like an unequal conversation between a very high, busy, busy, busy treble voice and then a low, slowly measured bass voice. You can draw your own picture to go with that. E major and C sharp minor. Do one more pair. This is, again, stunning. One is like a nocturne, the first one. This is number 13, F sharp major. And then its relative minor, E flat minor, D sharp minor, is it's reminiscent of the last movement of the B flat minor sonata, and the hands are in octaves, unison octaves. It's a little bit like a Bach toccata, but the harmonies and the cross rhythms are very intense and dark. It's very low, and it's kind of like a near miss of a shark attack. Is the way I think of it. Something very scary and very powerful comes and brushes up against you out of the dark and then disappears again. That's what it feels like. Whereas the other one is this gorgeous nocturne with one of the most sublime central episodes in all of the preludes. So from angel fingers to a dark demon. They're wonderful. They're all wonderful. I hope you will listen. It doesn't take that long to listen to all 24 of them, and get a sense of the range and of the tragic arc of the thing. We should move on. I'm prepared to sit here and just keep playing them, but we'll never get to the end, to the end of their 9 years together. So they survived Mallorca. He brought the preludes back and got them published. He mailed them out from Palma, sent them to a friend because he needed the money desperately now. They had spent all their travel money, and they went to Marseille. After the horrible boat ride with the hogs, they went to Marseille, and it took him 3 months to recover sufficiently to get on the road again and return to her summer home, Nohant, where they spent that summer. While they were in Marseille, Chopin's role changed. She realized that her role had changed completely from being a lover to a caretaker. And she wrote in her L'Histoire de ma vie, she wrote about this years later, about the psychological effect of that winter in Mallorca, how terrifying it was, that he had almost died. It was no honeymoon at all. It was a nightmare. Pascal is going to read for us an excerpt from Georges Sand's L'Histoire de ma vie.
A kind of terror seized me in the presence of a new duty which I was to take upon me. I was not under the illusion of passion. I had for the artist a kind of maternal adoration which was very warm, very real, but which could not for a moment contend with maternal love. One more duty in my life, already so full and so overburdened with work.
So now Sand sees herself a little bit in the role of a martyr, but she's a caregiver, no longer a lover, and she has to support about 12 people. And her house, Nohant, her estate, and the apartments in Paris, and the children and their education, and various staff. So she has to write. And they go back to Nohant, her country estate, and I have some pictures of that. I'll speak over the images and describe their life there when they survived Mallorca and the 3 months in Marseille. Finally, they were back at her home June 19th. This is after having left Paris in October. And it was a safe haven. It's very rustic. It's very beautiful. It's way out in the country. So there are the charms of country life, the safety and the beauty and the quiet, the peace and quiet to work. And her routine was to write all night and then sleep in the morning. His routine was to write in the mornings, come down for dinner and see the whole family at supper time, and then go to bed by 8 o'clock. Chopin went to bed when the children went to bed and sleep all night. They had adjoining rooms. Let's look at the next one. You can get an idea of the estate. This was her grandmother's house where Sand had been brought up. And there were a lot of outbuildings. There were barns, and there was room for her to give Delacroix a workshop when he came and stayed in the summer times. He had a whole studio. There was room for Maurice later to have a marionette theater. The little graveyard in the front is where her grandmother and all her family members are buried, and she is also buried there, that little churchyard. And then the house gives out to a river, and they could walk down to the river and bathe or go for walks. Or when they went for long walks in the country, Chopin sometimes went with them, but he didn't walk. He rode a donkey. He didn't have the strength to walk. Let's look at the next one. This is the famous portrait by Auguste Charpentier, 1838, which was the year they hooked up and went to Mallorca, and it's now hanging over the mantle in her sitting room there. You notice she's all in black. She wears the diamond crucifix. This was her standard outfit, and you can't see her hair, but in the back when she pinned up her hair, she pinned it up with a silver stiletto. This is a woman with, again, it reminds me of Madonna, the willingness to shock. When she started living with Chopin, she gave up the men's clothes and the cigars. She became much more conventional because he was so concerned about appearances and what will people think, and he wanted kind of a normal, respectable public life. Let's look at the next one. It's the music room there. There's the piano. I think this is the one that she bought for Liszt. She had this upright Erard piano because Liszt preferred an Erard. Chopin, of course, preferred a Pleyel, and so they later moved in a Pleyel piano. I think he had one upstairs in his room. Oh, a lovely singer, Pauline Viardot, very famous European singer and pianist and composer, worked with Chopin. She arranged many of his mazurkas as songs, which he was in complete agreement with. He thought that was great. And he's giving her a lesson here saying, don't do that. That's a Liszt trick. You never do that when you're accompanying the voice. Anything that Liszt did. Liszt had the reputation of teaching Chopin's pieces and adding things, adding like Liberace style arpeggios and trills and extra stuff. And of course, Chopin did not think much of this at all. He hated it. And so he would even refuse to teach students who had already studied with Liszt. Sketch of Maurice by Delacroix. Delacroix was there almost every summer for several weeks, became very close with Chopin, was a very close confidant for about 9 years, a close friend. And talented, and obviously he was trying to teach this boy to draw and to paint, but Maurice will be the cause of many of the future problems. Charpentier, who made the portrait of Sand, the one that hangs over the mantle, made this fan for her, and it's fascinating. I couldn't find out too much about it, but it has all of her lovers in it. She has her 2 children in there, her lovers. Delacroix himself, if you look right in the center of the picture, there's a group of 4 that I've put the enlargement of. Number 5 there, that's Delacroix himself. On the left is Franz Liszt, kneeling with his hands clasped at the feet of Georges Sand. And Sand is holding, perhaps on her arm, a bird. And the bird has the head of Chopin. Angel Fingers has become her pet. Those years were happy. They were very productive and very happy for the most part, especially up to about 1844-45, when Chopin did his best work. I would like to play for you one of the masterpieces that came out of this most happiest of time, when he was at the apex of both his creative powers and his emotional health, and things were good. The children were still young enough. They hadn't become difficult teenagers. And he wrote the Ballade in A-flat major, which, unlike the other 3 ballades, has a triumphantly happy, positive ending. The other 3 all have tragic, furious, dark endings, full of despair and full of rage. This one is the only one that is kind of, life is good, things are good. And it's amazingly written. If you listen very carefully to the opening tiny theme, the first 4 bars, the opening theme and response are just very spare, a melody that goes up and comes down with a repeated note. Out of that melody material comes everything else that develops thematically out into this ballade, which is an 8.5-minute long piece, ending with an apotheosis of this opening, very modest, very tender, spare little theme. If you can just remember, hold it in your mind, that opening theme, and just notice how it is transformed and comes back at the end at this glorious apotheosis finale. So here's the Ballade in A-flat major, Opus 47. So it's shortly after the disaster of Majorca. That's about the most fun a person can have. Oh my. Um, After that year, 1844-45, things started to go south. The children were getting older. Maurice was getting jealous. Sand had always treated Solange like an alien, unwanted child, and she was getting to be a teenager. This was a serious problem. And Chopin became more and more a spoiled child. She created a monster. She created the perfect storm for all his weaknesses to be fully harvested and to flower under her care. And she wrote a novel, Lucrezia Floriani, which was very thinly disguised, the story of their intimate life. Delacroix was there when they read excerpts of it, and he was astounded that Chopin didn't react. He seemed not to understand. But everybody who read this novel knew exactly what was going on. And then years later, it turned out Chopin did understand. He was just pretending. He used all his powers to make that mask, which he was so good at, creating the perfect, calm, in control mask. Pascal's now going to read an excerpt from Lucrezia Floriani, which shows just how badly things had deteriorated and how Sand saw Chopin at this time, at the end of their relationship.
As he was extremely polite and reserved, no one was able to understand what was going on in his mind. The more exasperated he became, the colder his manner. One could only judge the depths of its fury by the iciness of his polite behavior. He was flippant, stiff, affected, and bored with everything. He had the air of one who bites gently for the pleasure of doing it, and his bite went deep. Everything seemed uninteresting to him. He held aloof from every opinion, every idea. When someone tried to offer him some distraction, what could be trained than despise what was said to him and all that could be said?
Merci, Pascal. Such bitterness, such deep, deep bitterness and disappointment in that. I would like to end with one more piece written. This is the Berceuse, written at the end of a summer. They had been alone, which was hard on them, just Chopin and Sand, and Pauline Viardot dropped off her infant daughter for them to take care of because she was on tour. So they had the distraction and they got to play parents for a few weeks to this lovely child of a dear friend. And after that summer, Chopin composed the Berceuse. It is a miracle of composition. It only has two chords, a tonic and dominant chord for the first 54 measures, which sounds like suicide for a composer. But what he does is he writes a series of variations on top of this very simple bass line, rocking bass line. It's a cradle song. Berceuse means cradle song. And it's the last sweetness of the last lovely summer that they had together before everything really, really went south, which is what I will talk about next week, the end of his life. But here, let me play for you the Berceuse. This is Opus 57. we'll leave it at there for today. Next week, we'll handle the breakup and the end of Chopin's life. And there's a little bit more music, but most of the wonderful music was written the 9 years he was with George Sand.